Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed." On June 12, 1944, 63 Japanese Americans incarcerated at the Heart Mountain Relocation Center chose to defy the draft and the U.S. government for the sake of freedom, which sparked debate. This documentary takes a closer look at the debate surrounding the draft resistance at Heart Mountain.
Debate throughout history can help prevent the same negative events from happening again. An entire nation was changed with the attack on Pearl Harbor, which destroyed the U.S. Pacific Fleet. This attack came without warning and subsequently drove the U.S. to enter the Pacific and European theaters of World War II. With over 2,000 of our servicemen and civilians killed, the Japanese were enemy number one. There were two sides drawn, one of Japanese ancestry and everyone else.
Once Congress declared war on Japan on December 8, 1941, the Japanese residents in America became quick scapegoats who were feared, blamed, and hated. Immediately, frenzy ensued. Hostility, racism, and prejudice toward all Japanese was rampant. Due to the heightened anti-Japanese sentiments on January 4, 1942, the government changed the classification of Nisei Selective Service registrants from 4C alien or dual national to aliens or any other group not acceptable to the armed forces. Did this change mean that the Nisei were less American? Many of these men wanted to show their loyalty by enlisting so they could defend the United States from the enemy even if it was Japan. Military necessity and national security deemed that the threats needed to be identified. So on February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066 authorizing the Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson to prescribe certain areas as military zones. These zones would prevent espionage and protect the Japanese from angry Americans. The War Civil Control Administration, of WCCA, immediately began setting up assembly centers to process all deportees. Executive Order 9102 was handed down by Roosevelt, which created the War Relocation Authority, or WRA. This civilian agency would take over the long-term supervision of all Japanese deportees. By March 1942, DeWitt's Public Proclamation No. 4 took effect, and the Nikkei, or anyone of Japanese descent, were told that they must register with the WCCA. They were told only to bring what they could carry. The deportees were sent into a panic. What possessions they couldn't sell had to be abandoned. The non-Asian communities around the world and the US had little sympathy for the Japanese and didn't want them.
There was little talk among the Nikkei about not complying with this exile request. America was demanding that they prove their loyalty, so they pledged their support to the country and President Roosevelt by complying with this request. This was the ultimate wartime sacrifice, especially for those 65 to 70,000 who were already American citizens.
Well, I was objecting because, after all, we're American citizens. We have just as much rights as anybody else, and we have just as much the right with our Constitution. We have a day in court. We should have a day in court.
Upon arrival at their new homes, the internees were shocked to find barracks surrounded by barbed wire, accessorized with guard towers. Some were told that they were being moved for their own protection, but wondered why the guard towers and guns were pointed inward rather than outward. They were greeted by harsh temperatures with little or no winter clothing. Their green farmlands and urban dwellings were replaced by searing desert heat, barren open spaces for as far as the eye could see.
During late 1942, the JACL, or Japanese American Citizens League, forged an alliance with the WRA. They were desperate to exploit the Nisei loyalty to the US government and American public, even if it meant reinstating the draft. On February 1, 1943, Roosevelt announced that the military would organize a segregated combat team of Nisei. He said that Americanism was a matter of mind and heart, not race or ancestry. No loyal citizen should be prevented from serving in the military. Roosevelt planned to have the Nisei volunteer rather than be drafted. After all, would it be fair to evacuate people and then impose the draft procedures? The US government and career branches of the military thought that the Nisei fighting would help rehabilitate them. Military registration teams from the War Department were sent to register the internees for this segregated Nisei combat unit. How they could fight for a country who less than a year earlier were deeply suspicious of them and had stripped them of their lives and imprisoned them. Was this really a question of military service or pledging loyalty to the United States? On January 6, 1943, internees from Post and Relocation Camp in Arizona sent a letter to FDR stating, "Recognize us as citizens and we will gladly serve in the Army, but we will not serve in the army to persuade you to recognize us as citizens.
On January 20th, 1944, the government reclassified the Japanese Americans and reinstated the draft. The Fair Play Committee organization that was taking hold at Heart Mountain questioned the registration and now the draft. The leaders, Kiyoshi Okamoto, Paul Nakadata, and Frank Emmy, began holding meetings for the internees who professed their loyalty to the United States and wished to serve in the military once their civil rights and due process were restored.
The FPC asked for the restoration of all civil rights prior to being drafted into the military. At Heart Mountain, there was debate about compliance with the JACL. The camp paper, Heart Mountain Sentinel, rarely challenged the camp administration or WRA policies. A Japanese-American newspaper out of Denver, Colorado, the Rocky Shimpo, had an editor by the name of Jimmy Omura. The FPC's actions had caught his attention, and he wrote about them often. His articles caught the attention of the U.S. government, who eventually charged with counseling the young draft resistors. He was acquitted in the U.S. District Court due to his First Amendment rights. At the end of March 1944, 63 Nisei Japanese draft resistors sat in Wyoming jail cells awaiting their prosecution in U.S. District Court for evading the draft. U.S. versus Shigeru Fuji et al., the largest mass trial in Wyoming history, began on June 12, 1944 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The defense attorney waived the defendant's rights to a jury trial under the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution. On the first day of the proceedings, Judge T. Blake Kennedy addressed the defendants as, "You Jap boys," so they knew that they were in trouble. The defense examined the motives for their evasion and concentrated on their willingness to serve in the military once their civil rights were restored. Yoshikuro Maya's statement to the FBI said if he did not protest his treatment, then he would be just as responsible as those who make the decision to intern him. Judge Kennedy announced his decision and convicted all 63 Nisei men on one count of draft resistance and sentenced them to 3 years in federal prison.
In Kennedy's decision, he stated that the resistors' mistake was to protest rather than to submit to government orders. If they were true citizens, then they would embrace an opportunity to discharge their duties as citizens. Again, the debate arises: what constitutes a true citizen?
After serving their sentence, Chief Justice Owen Roberts granted amnesty to the resistors in March 1947. The Roberts Board recommended pardons because prior to their internment, these men were law-abiding citizens and loyal citizens who deeply resented the classification as an undesirable. Most of them have remained loyal. Some of the draft resistors, such as Tak Hoshizaki, fought in the Korean War. President Truman granted a full pardon on December 24, 1947, including restoration of all political and civil rights.
We must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
Some say today justice was finally done. President Reagan.
The 1988 Civil Liberties Act, which was sponsored by Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming and Daniel K. Inouye of Hawaii, was signed into law by President Reagan. This legislation gave each surviving American internee $20,000 in compensation and stated that the government actions were based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership as opposed to genuine legitimacy.
But I think it was fair. Of course, the Japanese Americans, there were some who didn't want to accept it. They said, look, we're at war, we're Americans, we don't deserve anything.
Even with the pardon by Truman, the JACL had mixed opinions. They welcomed the pardon but still criticized the resistors for facilitating the racism and prejudice the Japanese had endured. It wasn't until July of 2000, after years of debate, that a resolution was passed, offered an apology to the draft resistors.
Our government responded to a unique threat to national security in a debatably suitable manner in the context of history. These Japanese men responded with courage, which caused much debate. Many of these men didn't talk about their experiences for over 30 years. Some of their children didn't know anything about their protest for freedom until the JACL opened old wounds and apologized in 2000. These men emerged from this experience with little bitterness toward the American government. They were men who were called upon to fight for their country, but first had to fight for their rights of freedom in America. The resistors' patriotism was a patriotism of protest. The internment of Japanese Americans from the West Coast in and of itself brought about much debate. Heart Mountain draft resistors raised additional questions. What constitutes a loyal citizen? Were these interned Americans still U.S. citizens with all rights that this entails? How does your place of residence deem you undesirable? Were these people threats to national security? Is serving in the military the only means of proving one's loyalty? Should these imprisoned Americans be deemed suitable or unfit for military service? Should these men have willingly complied with all governmental demands or protested for clarity and citizenship? These are the many questions which framed the debate surrounding the draft resistors of Heart Mountain.